I'm co-presenting this session. I'm Peter Monks with Rich McKnight, my colleague at Alfresco. And I guess we can go ahead and get started. So the format for today's talk is I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about what the bulk file system import tool is, what's new in the tool since last time I talked about it at DevCon 2 years ago, his experiences with the tool, how he's seen it used at customers, and what is coming next. Before we get started though, how many people here, but just by show of hands, either know what the tool is or have used it? Oh wow, all of you. Okay, so almost all of you. So the first section I'll try to rush through fairly quickly because it'll be mostly second nature to those of you who've used the tool. So I'm going to do this sort of in story form. Once upon a time, there was the impregnable castle Alfresco, and it was well protected from the hordes of barbarian content that came from systems like SharePoint and Documentum and OpenText and so on. And that was a wonderful thing, except for the fact that there were only these archaic mechanisms for getting content into the system. There were things like ACP files. There were protocols like FTP and WebDAV, sort of closely related. And then, of course, there was the chimera that was CIFS. And any of you who've tried to import large amounts of content via any of these mechanisms will know quite well just how difficult it is to get your content into Castle Alfresco using these things. Now, at the time, soon after I joined Alfresco in 2007, I ran into this problem, and I was working with a customer in Los Angeles who had a large amount of content that they needed to bring into the system. And they were actually using CIFS or attempting to use CIFS for this. And it was not working well for them. So as a consulting, at that time as a consultant, we constructed a deal and I wrote an import tool for that customer. And that tool eventually grew to become what we now call the bulk file system import tool. And so this is sort of supposed to be me. I've been likened to Jack Sparrow in the past, hence the imagery. And then the big ship is, of course, the bulk import tool, which can carry large amounts of content with high performance characteristics into and out of Alfresco. Now, the bulk file system import tool is primarily focused on high performance import of large amounts of content. It doesn't do things like extraction from other systems. It doesn't do things like supporting sort of unusual parts of the Alfresco repository. Some examples might be circular association graphs, peer association graphs. It's really focused very myopically on high performance import. And that's because there have been two primary use cases I've seen that need this kind of capability. The first one are one-time content migrations. A customer purchases Alfresco. They're looking to decommission their prior system, SharePoint, Documentum, OpenText, whatever that is. And they simply want to bulk import all of the content from the old system or some large subset of it to the new system. And that's a very common use case. And there are other tools in the community that also support this kind of thing, or particularly on the source system side. The second use case, and actually the use case that the tool was originally developed for, was repeated feeds. This is where a customer has some source of content coming into the system and they're repeatedly loading that content or periodically loading that content into Alfresco. The company I was working with in Los Angeles was actually a movie. They worked in the movie business. They received still images from movies, several thousand an hour, and they needed to import those every hour on the hour, well, every hour kind of repeatedly, and CIFS wasn't up to the task, but this tool took their load times from about an hour and a half every hour to about 5 minutes every hour, which they were pretty happy about. It is community maintained, so the code is in Google Code. The project is hosted on the Google Code open source platform or source development platform. And there are a number of contributors, some of whom are, I think, in this room, including Rich, who've contributed patches, enhancements, etc. to the tool. And as the maintainer, I'm more than happy to have others contribute bug fixes, bug reports, patches, wiki page updates, comments, you name it. Any kind of contribution is really more than welcome. One thing to note is this is no longer my day job, so my time on the project is limited. It's not my day job to work on this, so hence my interest in having all of you contribute whatever you can to the tool. The tool is Apache licensed, so it is liberally licensed. You are free to use it as you wish. You're free to modify it as you wish and redistribute it as you wish. There is no kind of virality. There's no clauses that might cause problems in a commercial or that kind of a enterprise environment. In terms of adoption, it's pretty widely adopted at this point. I have no real way of knowing how much adoption there is, but at this point I know for a fact that it's used in about 24 enterprise customers, so those are customers that I'm directly aware of using the tool. I think the number's higher than that because some of you and obviously others have downloaded it and used it without my knowledge. I also know that it's used in about 400 community installations, so I can see the download data and see where those downloads are coming from. Many of them are from companies that are not customers of Alfresco. And then finally, there are several other Alfresco extensions that use it, including TSG, Ray's here in the audience. TSG's Open Migrate tool. There's another tool called Simplify that's developed here in the US that also uses it, and some other extensions. So it's pretty well adopted at this point, and has a good deal of traction. Now, one thing to note is that a fork of the tool was created approximately 18 months ago when 4.0 was released, and included in the 4.0, 4.1, and now 4.2 products. It's an early version of the tool, and has not been maintained with the Google Code version. So one thing, just as a sort of a warning or a heads up, you can certainly use the supported version of the tool, the one that's bundled. It is quite a bit older. It's now 18 months to 2 years out of date. And some of the things you'll see here, you will not see if you're using that version of the tool. The one that's on Google Code is the original and best, in my opinion. I've worked hard to make sure they're mutually compatible. If you install a Google Code one, it will live side by side with the copy, with the fork, and you can use either or both as you wish. So there's no issues with kind of compatibility or anything like that. So what's new in the bulk import tool since last time I talked about it? Those of you who were at DevCon 2011 may remember the talk I gave there. Probably the most eye-candy-ish, exciting, shiny bauble that was added was a real-time graph, and you don't get it from this screenshot, you don't get the sense of it, but this is actually a moving graph that graphs the throughput, the approximate throughput of the tool as an import is progressing. So this is a way to get a little bit more visual representation. You can kind of get a better sense of how your import is running by looking at this graph. And this is now the default status view of the tool. When you initiate an import, this is what you will see by default. And you'll notice here that we're seeing somewhere between, well, the top of the graph is 104 documents per second. That's documents ingested per second. And it's averaging at, well, that's probably 40 to 60 documents per second. And with 4.2, this screenshot was taken on Alfresco 4.2, that's the kind of performance you should expect from a laptop. So to give you an idea of performance, that's roughly what you should expect from fairly low-class hardware. On a production, attuned, maintained, optimized production system, you should expect somewhat better than that. Now, this is bytes per second. It's only 4K per second. This is actually testing a rather, or the import I'm doing here is the unit test case from the tool, and it has a lot of very small files, which is why the actual data rate is so low. You should expect for a real-world data set that to be significantly higher, particularly if you're doing an in-place import. The original status report is still available. You can still get all of the details of exactly what's going on and where it's up to, how many threads are active, all sorts of details. And as with previous versions of the tools, there are also XML and JSON representations of this so that you can poll it from scripts, for example, to find out whether it's finished, where it's at, etc. So what's new beyond those two things? First of all, the version that I'm working on right now, I'd hope to get released before this DevCon, or sorry, this summit event, and I didn't quite get it done, but it is working on 4.1 already, and I'm testing and developing the new version on 4.2, so it's known to work there. You can stop in-flight imports, so if you're in the middle of an import and something goes wrong, something is misbehaving or you just want to stop it and start again, you can hit a stop button and it will stop. Again, there's also a web script that you can script to do that, so you can do it from your own client applications. There's support for metadata-only nodes. So if you've got an object that doesn't have content, doesn't have a file associated with it, you can now create those using the tool. There's support for custom parent-child associations. These are folders that aren't your traditional CM contains folder. This is useful for creating things like rules, of course, custom models as well. And then finally, we have support for major and minor versions. One thing to note, Alfresco doesn't support setting the version label explicitly. That's just a feature of the product. So while you can control whether a version increment is minor or major, you can't actually explicitly control precisely what that label will be. So if you're importing content that is gappy, has a gappy version history, it might go version 1.0, 2.0, 2.2, 2.3, 2.7, 2.12. You can't preserve that version history into Alfresco when you import it. And that's a limitation of Alfresco itself. In the issue tracker on Google Code, there is an issue on this which links to the underlying product issue. So if you want to go and check that out, you can. So you can capture major and minor, but it'll be 1.0, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 2.0, etc. It'll be a non-gappy version history. In terms of what's planned, these are some of the things that I have planned for future releases beyond the 1.3 that is almost complete now. The first is support for ACL, so being able to set permissions from on the data that's being ingested, on the content that's being ingested. Pluggable sources, which Rich will talk about in a lot more detail in his section of the talk. The ability to perform a dry run, so you can actually just check a checkbox and say, pretend that you're importing, but don't actually import. Just tell me what it is you would have done otherwise. And then finally, support for Clippy. In fact, Colin Stevenson over there on the right, do you want to put your hand up? He's been doing a lot of work with the tool, and he complained one day that it was very boring to watch these things run. He also sent me a link to a JavaScript port of the Microsoft Clippy agent from about 15 years ago and suggested that I jam that in there. So at some point, I may add Clippy support to the tool just for entertainment value. For more information, the Google Code project is really the best place to go. There is also a mailing list. I really encourage people to try to use that rather than the issue tracker or commenting on the wiki pages. It's just much easier to track, and it's more engaged. Colin, I know, jumps in and answers questions, and others too at times, which is great when I'm busy. And then failing that, come and find me at the event. I'm mostly hanging out at the expert bar. That's where I'll be holding court. So come and chat if there's anything import related you'd like to talk about. Without further ado, let me introduce Rich McKnight.
Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm going to start by talking about my journey with the bulk file system import tool. If you can imagine, one day I discovered this awesome tool, and it's like it's like your classic, geek meets utility story. I mean, you meet the utility, you say, wow, this is awesome. And it's a hammer, so everything's a nail at that point. Even if it's a nail with little grooves in it, it's like, oh yeah, I can just make the hammer that turns like this or whatever. But seriously, when I saw the value of the tool, and a couple of use cases came up, and those use cases had their unique twists about them. And so in each of those use cases, I ended up tweaking the tool a little bit, or tweaking being a euphemism for forking the tool. And after doing that a few times, I kind of scratched my head and I said, this is a lot of work. And at the conclusion of this, we'll talk about some of my observations through going through a couple of forks of it and trying to figure out how to take those requirements and get them back into the tool. And I will add this disclaimer. Peter and I have some differing views on some things about it, and I classify it along the lines of reasonable people can disagree, and so this different approaches, but I think we understand where each other where we sit on the issue, and if nobody asked the question, I think we should discuss it at the end. So the first thing I'd like to talk about, why do we love the bulk file system import tool? Well, two reasons. First of all, it's fast. That's because it's so smart. And the second is because it's simple. Okay? At the end of the day, it provides high performance migration or ingestion into a repository. And there's the principles on which this tool was built that give it that high performance. For one thing, you stage content as close to the repository as you can. Now, closeness comes in different flavors. Well, you could stream the content in, but then that's the furthest away, and that's going to be the slowest version of it. You can put the content on the same machine, and there, it's not quite an in-place import, but you're using file system level copies, and that's a little bit faster. Or you can, if you want it to be really close, you can either put it on the same device or actually put it in the content store. And if you put it in the content store, then you have an in-place import. The other thing that it does to get this high performance is it goes folder by folder. And by doing that, you're grouping children of the same folder together. You're not updating multiple folders at the same time, but you're doing a number of operations, and that parent folder gets updated, once or twice, depending on the size of your transactions. And it's a systematic way of going through it. And then the third thing we do is we group the operations together in reasonable chunks. You don't want to have one transaction per operation because then it's heavy on the database. But at the same token, you don't want to have large transactions because then they can chew up memory, chew up disk, and they have their own performance problems. And quite honestly, depending on your use case, we usually use a transaction size of 100 operations per transaction. But if you're running the bulk file system import tool alongside of daily operation, if you're running it, you might want to set that transaction size to be a little smaller so that users doing work can actually get a word in edgewise and do what they have to do. So the other side to the popularity of the bulk file system import tool is that it's simple. It replicates the hierarchy that you have, and so you have content to put in. You put it in you give it the hierarchy that it needs to be in the target, and then you just point it at it. It makes it easy to specify metadata because you can just put your metadata files in your hierarchy, and you have a naming convention, and it gets put in. And as a result, it's easy because there's no programming necessary. But there's also no programming allowed, which may make it a little inflexible for certain use cases. And that's where the story gets a little complex, because the success of this tool brought new challenges. For instance, we might want to import content that's not in a file system or in a file system tree. Maybe it's in a legacy system that has its own notion of hierarchy, but similar to Alfresco, the actual hierarchy or the folder structure around the files does not, the physical hierarchy does not match the logical hierarchy. That's one thing that we might run into. Maybe there are other bits of information we want to pull into the repository. Maybe we want to pull in access control. Maybe we want to migrate non-folder file folder content, like, for instance, rules or comments or things like that. And finally, maybe we want to restructure the folder hierarchy when we're importing it. Now, some of these issues, like non-file folder content, is actually going to be addressed in the next release of the bulk file system import tool. But when I started on this journey, I was probably using the version that was forked and put into the supported tool. So I was looking at, and that's what I was dealing with, and that's why we ended up doing, forking it. But one of the things that I learned in going through the forking process is that this tool does provide the basis for efficient, systematic, methodical moving of massive amounts of content into the repository. And so even throughout this journey, the principles on which the tool was built, provide the basis for this, for efficient imports. So I'm going to talk about the two use cases that I had with the import tool. And in one case, the customer was decommissioning a homegrown tool that had limited usage within a few departments. Single location, primary usage was business hours, and it was a gradual cutover. Now in this case, there were some challenges that this particular repository presented. For instance, the legacy system allowed duplicate file names in the same folder. Of course, Alfresco doesn't allow that, so we had to figure out how to handle that. We also, in their system, they also allowed file names that had characters that would not be legal characters in Alfresco. For instance, slashes were valid characters in their file names. There were other things in terms of audit history that they wanted to migrate in. And their metadata was in database tables. So rather than having them in files, they were in database tables. The folder structure was different. And so we needed to figure out how to handle that. The other use case that we had was a conversion from a customized instance of knowledge tree. Now in this case, it was a much larger system. They actually had 3 systems, so they had 3 different versions of the system that were targeted at 3 different audiences. It was used globally. They pretty much had to be available 24/7, and they were doing a big bang cutover. So there were some other challenges there. And in their particular system, some of the challenges beyond the fact that it was 24/7 and we had to do this quickly, they wanted to migrate version history. Now, interestingly enough, Peter talked about the fact that if it's gappy, we're not going to be able to replicate that in Alfresco. And we actually ran into that. And so the way we actually handled that was we honored major and minor. And if the version label that was resulting was not the same as the version label that came from the original system, what we actually did was we created an aspect that says this has a version mismatch, and we then put the original version label as an attribute on that aspect. And that's actually similar to what we did when we handled either duplicate file names or file names where the names were illegal. We actually picked a file name that we could put in there that was actually legal, and then we actually added the information that said, oh, by the way, we had to change this from the original legacy system because of X, Y, Z. In this case, we also had to migrate audit history, and we migrated permissions also. And the other thing that we did was we migrated users and groups. And one of the anomalies to this particular system is they had, the knowledge tree system had a folder for each user. And so we actually so the first thing we did is we said, let's get all the user folders. Then they also had a number of groups. So each group had their own folder. So you had user folders and group folders. So we first got the groups. First got the users, then got the groups, and then we handled all of the other folders. So one of the things we did is, rather than go through just start at the top and go, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, we actually said we have to do this systematically. So that was the first piece that caused us to have to fork this a little bit. We had to actually have a more systematic way of walking through the tree. And I think we've covered most of this already. We've talked about this. Just one thing about the non-file folder content. So we did actually migrate on the large system use case B, we did migrate conversations and things like that. In the case of, and we also imported permissions. I'm trying to remember, because we went through a number of iterations, and I don't remember if we did this or not, but one of the things we actually did talk about, and I think we may have done, is migrating the content first, getting through all the content, and then going back and saying, okay, you know what? We might not need to have the conversations in place right away. So if we, because we had a tight window, some of the things we just look, what has to happen before we turn the lights back on? And what can be done, you know, after we bring this up? So some of the trade-offs we looked at were around, you know, importing permissions after the fact, you know, importing conversations and things like that after the fact. So those are some of the things that we went through. And in both cases, we ended up forking it. I think I've just gone through all of this, so you'll have this list later. One of the things that we did, though, our forks did follow a pattern. So we didn't just randomly go and say, okay, how do we do this? We actually had a method behind this. If we look at the file system import tool, you recursively go down the folder tree. We replaced that recursive navigation with something that we called a legacy component. And the legacy component was designed to peer into the legacy system and allow us to navigate through that system much in the same way we would navigate through a file system. Some of the lessons that we learned along the way. Now, before we go there, so in use case A, we did lazy migration. So in that case, one of the things we did was, one of the things that was important was that we had to keep track of what was migrated. So part of what the legacy system the legacy component had to do is when we said, okay, we're going to migrate this part of the repository. Once we migrated that part of the repository, we had to mark the folder to say the folders that had been migrated and said, these have been migrated. And so, and the reason we had to do that was throughout the rest of the enterprise, they had links to the legacy system. And so what needed to happen is if you went to the legacy system and that was a migrated piece of content, it had to be redirected to Alfresco to pick up the content. The other thing that we had to do in Alfresco, we had to pull over the legacy IDs so that from Alfresco, we said, look, I need the content for this ID. And so we actually had to take the URL of the same type and say, okay, where is that content now? So part of what we had to do was mark the content so that if they hit the legacy system and it was migrated, then we had to go to Alfresco with the same information to be able to get the content as it had been migrated. And then once the legacy system was shut down, you could just redirect everything to Alfresco and it could still find legacy content based on its legacy IDs. In the case of the large one that we had to migrate, we actually had to migrate, the biggest repository that we had about 1.2 million documents, objects in the repository. And we had about a 6-hour window where that had to happen. And I have to say, and this probably should be on one of the lessons learned, one of the lessons that we learned is that performance matters and performance doesn't come for free. And how this legacy component was designed had a big role in performance. And so when we first turned this up to do it, we found that the performance stunk. The thing that's interesting about what the file system import tool does is everything is on the file system. And one of the things we found is that if you're getting piecemeal content from the database, you're adding to that round trip for each piece of content that you have to do. And that hurt us. And so what the customer actually did, they looked at it and said, you know what? All this content we have in our database, let's just dump it onto the file system. The tables that are small enough will load up into memory. The tables that are too big, what we'll actually do is just load up an index to them in memory, and then we can use random access to get that information out. And all of a sudden, it screamed. But it was like having a set of files that had all our metadata, but rather than being on individual files, they were spread out in a way that it was easy to access them and get them in a cached manner. So some of the lessons that we learned. Data cleansing is important. I mean, one of the things we saw in use case B is we actually had to touch up content after the fact. And we kind of, and the lesson learned there was test, 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 and test again, especially when you're doing a major import. And we had tested a lot of things, but there were a couple of things that we missed. And I was talking to them afterwards. I said, you know what? We had to go back and touch this up. And so that was one lesson learned. We talked about performance not coming for free. And so one of the things you have to do, is have a plan. No matter how well your import's going to go, have a plan for dealing with post-migration rubbish. And even if you're doing this not as a one-time big bang import, but a nightly feed where you're pulling content in, be prepared to figure out how you're going to deal with failures and things like that. Because it may be that you can't turn back. You've got to deal with what's there and figure out what to do with it. How are we doing on time here? Okay. But the most important thing that I learned, I hate forking code. I just hate doing it. I mean, we got it to work. We did it twice, but it's hard work. And I just didn't, when I got to the next one that I had to do, I did not want to do it a third time. So at that point, I started thinking about what can we do to turn this into a framework. And part of the things that we need for it to work properly is we've got to have a more flexible way of dealing with the metadata. In a lot of cases, the metadata might be in a single manifest file. It might be in a spreadsheet, that says, okay, I have all these files, and they're on the file system. Now, of course, when you have that situation, you still have to think about, well, what if, how are you going to handle inconsistencies in the content and the metadata and things like that? So those are things you have to think about, but, we have to support things like that. In some cases, you might have to rearrange the folder hierarchy. And in some cases, you might want to add post-processing in the process, or maybe even upon each import, or upon each object import, maybe you want to have a callback to do a couple of things. Now, if you do that, keep in mind that performance doesn't come for free. So if you are going to do something on each object that gets imported, make sure it's something quick and it's appropriate for something that's in that process. But having the flexibility for support of non-file folder content does give you the flexibility to add rules and comments, and that comes for free. Now, how is a framework different? So if I look at this framework, how is that going to be different? Well, and this is the way I envision it, and this is, very, and this is based on the use cases that I've gone on. And this is the point where, Peter might disagree, and I think that there's two schools of thought here, and I want to put it out there that there's two schools of thought. One school of thought is, rather than putting this into the importer, have a preprocessor that just creates that moves everything into the proper place and then run the importer plain vanilla. And I think that that's a valid case. The other case is, well, can I do something that in a way that performs properly, takes it as is, and gets the best and the brightest of the importer and puts it in? The biggest concern I have about the pre-processing part is the fact that when I create all these bits of metadata and put them into the content store, especially if I have a nightly feed that's going over and over again, those files, those property files, never go away if I'm doing in-place import, unless I actually go and take the risk of going in and surgically removing them. And so my biggest concern is accumulation of these files. However so small, it's just, for me, it's a point of digital hygiene. But, so the importer walks the tree. in the framework that I'm looking at, we have importable object bundles that are passed to the framework. So rather than the framework saying, okay, I'm walking through the folder tree, you have the thing that's driving the framework say, here's a bundle. The bundles would correspond to a folder at each level. And you say, okay, here's this level, process that. Okay, here's one of its children, and you would go down systematically. But that would be so that would be you looking at the data and giving it to the importer in the sequence that is necessary. Right now, the importer parses the metadata as it goes through. In the framework I'm looking at, you actually parse the metadata and it's passed in the bundles, already pre-digested. And again, how you do that is going to be very important, because if you don't do it right, you can end up with performance problems. The folder structure of the content in the bulk file system, it matches the target folder. In this case, it can be arbitrary, and it would probably be gleaned from the metadata. So the metadata that you're processing is probably going to give you the information about how, where these files should live on the target system. In this case, the folder is the importer is responsible for the performance. In this case, if you're going to extend it, you've got to make sure that you don't negatively impact performance. And that's the key risk of using the framework, that you might do something that's not going to perform properly. And that's the decision you're going to have to make. Do you do this because it's more efficient overall, or do you take the approach you say, well, let me just create it in the format that it needs it, and then I know that the importer is going to have a certain level of performance. The other thing we look at is migrations versus input feeds. The migration, we have a one-time execution, and we can plan for it. We can go through, we can try it over and over and over again. We can run through the different problems that we're going to run into and get it right the first time. In the case of a nightly feed, you've got to think about all of the edge cases that you're going to have and plan for them, and then have a way to deal with any failures that might occur. Either can you roll it back? Do you have to restart it? How do you clean it up? So you're cleaning up content and known content in one place, and the other place you're saying, I don't know what's going to happen. And there are interesting implications when you talk about in-place import when you deal with input feeds. When we look at the input feed, a nightly feed coming in, for a one-time import, you have a system administrator that's going to get the content and then move it underneath the content store and say, okay, now I'm going to perform my in-place import. For a nightly feed, I'm not sure that I want an FTP process dropping content right into my content store. That just doesn't seem safe, doesn't seem prudent. But you can drop it onto the same device that your content store is on. So what I would recommend is you have a folder, and maybe a drop zone folder, and maybe that you create it by, and maybe you just drop it there. And once it's done, then you have a process that says, okay, now I'm going to do a move. It's one inode change into the content store, maybe maybe arranging it based on the date or whatever. So just to do it in a systematic, orderly way. But so those are the kinds of things that might be different when you have an input feed, especially with an in-place store. So that's something I would just recommend as a matter of course. So having talked about that, what's next? I'm currently working on a framework-ish like implementation. Sorry, I had to make up a word there. Once the implementation has been proven, then we'll review it for smartness and simplicity, and if it passes muster, then we'll look at taking it and tidying it up and turning it and recontributing it back into the bulk file system import tool as an alternate way of getting content in using the principles of high performance that the bulk file system import tool does. And that's basically my story before it. Like I said, I think it's an awesome tool. I've had to fork it. Now I want to do things in a way that doesn't mean a new fork each time. Okay. We got 10 minutes, and we have enough time for questions. Back.
So the question was the new feature, and I think that microphone stopped working again. The question was, for metadata-only nodes, can you use that to import folders? Metadata for custom folder types. Yeah, that's been in the tool since day one. So folders were always content-only nodes because folders don't have content, and you could always assign a custom type, custom folder type. So the way that's done is in the shipping version of the tool, you just have a shadow metadata file for the folder, and it will happily apply that metadata, including types, aspects, property values, etc., to the folder. There are some limitations. You can't, for example, turn on versioning for a folder. You can try. You can list the versionable aspect in the list of aspects for the folder. It will basically ignore you. In fact, I can't remember if the tool explicitly strips that out or if it just lets a repository deal with it. It's possible the repository will fail, will throw an exception, and at that point the bulk import will just stop. But you can't version folders is the short answer. So the second question was, can you use metadata-only nodes to load a data list? I believe so. This is new in 1.3. So a metadata-only content node is new in 1.3. I've been testing it using rules. Depending on where the data lists get stored, I'm pretty sure they're just a subfolder of a site. There shouldn't be any restriction, except potentially for peer associations. So peer associations remain unsupported. And so if your data list type has peer associations, then all bets are off.
One thing to note, data lists are actually derived from files, so they actually have content associated with them. Yeah. If it's not used.
It may not be mandatory though. Yeah? So the question was, and I'm just repeating it for the recording in case anyone's wondering. The question was, the fork that was created 18 months ago, basically what's the plan for that? Is there going to be a refork? Is it going to be updated to match what's in the Google Code project, etc.? The short answer is I have no idea. Product management would be the folks to talk to about that. So I don't know if we have any product managers in the room. I don't think we do. Question at the front. Yep, so the question was, the benchmark data that was shown in the screenshot was running on the laptop. In fact, this guy right here. Do we have any benchmarks for a server class system? What I have are benchmarks on Amazon, but not well optimized, so not using the S3 connector or anything fancy like that. So that's not really a good basis. What I also have is data from some of you in the audience on the imports you've done. The fastest rate I've seen or heard of was 650 documents per second. That was actually 40 million documents imported in about 17 hours. And, well, the total number was 40 million documents in about 17 hours. Now, the total data set size, I think it was in the terabyte range. We also have another data point from a customer in Europe who imported, they imported 6.6 terabytes of data in 2 minutes, but that was an in-place import, so it's a bit of a cheat because it was actually a very small number of files that were very large. They had several 100,000 files, but yeah, that loads fast. And an in-place import doesn't actually physically copy the data at all, so you can effectively have infinite, well, almost infinite data transfer because there's no data transfer. So I like to use that as a vanity statistic, but really it was a couple of 100,000. I think it was about 260,000 documents in 2 minutes. And I have one or two other data points. In fact, the 2011 presentation I gave on this, which is on SlideShare, I think the slide notes in that presentation, I list those out. Yeah. Question up the back. So the question was, the background of the question was, about a year ago you were using the tool pretty extensively to import large amounts of data. There were some batches that were failing. It was difficult to track and figure out exactly, or report and figure out exactly which batches had failed. the solution you used was to rerun it without replacement over and over and over until it succeeded. Has there been any, and the question was, has there been any improvement since then? The answer is no, there hasn't been any improvement. And part of that is because some of what occurs in the bulk import tool is not deterministic. It's a multi-threaded process, so when it's divided, the batching process itself is deterministic. It will always batch a certain set, a corpus of data the same way. However, the way that, and the order that that gets imported into Alfresco depends on how Java's threading implementation works. Java util concurrent is what it's using, and that is not deterministic, really. I'm surprised to find you had batches fail because the tool is designed to fail fast. It doesn't fail and then continue running. When it fails hard and it completely stops, and you shouldn't be able to keep on going. Separate imports. Yeah. If you're doing sort of lots of small imports, then I could imagine how you might run into that. The answer is no, but you should be getting good reporting on what failed. And your workaround, which is to simply rerun it again with replacement turned off, is the way. And that's exactly why that switch was put in way back in the original version of it, was because the best way, and I've done a lot of migration work, particularly at a previous vendor I worked for, and my experience in doing that was the best way to handle errors is to allow the tool to be rerunnable on exactly the same source data set, but for it to quickly skip the work it's already done. The question then is, how do you know you're done? And that's why fail fast is so important. The tool is designed to blow up and stop the first issue it hits. And that way you know that you're not yet done and you will need to rerun with replace set to false. I think we might have time for one more question if there's any more. Great. Thank you very much for attending.